So, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So, I will welcome. Let me just change my view so I can see Lynn properly. There we go. So, thank you very much for joining the Birthplace of Country Music Museum tonight for this virtual speaker series. We're very glad to see you all there. We've got a full house tonight, which is awesome. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started with Lynn. Please stay muted if you haven't already done so. Go ahead and mute your computer and also turn your video off during the presentation. That way it just stays on the speaker view for most people, so it makes it easier for people to see Lynn when she's talking. If you have any questions that you would like to ask Lynn as we're going through the presentation, please go ahead and put them in the chat box, the Zoom chat. We will be coming to those questions at the end of the presentation, and Scotty will be facilitating those so that you get all of your questions answered by either myself or by Lynn. And finally, in the next couple of days after tonight's presentation, you will get a short, like 2 or 3 minute survey via your email from SurveyMonkey. We would love to hear your feedback on tonight's session and also on thoughts you might have for future virtual speaker series, because we've now been doing this for almost a year and we want to keep going with it. And we're very grateful to how many people have joined us each month. Some of you who have done, which has been wonderful. So we really value that feedback. So let's get started. I think the night is drawing in, at least here on the East Coast. So it's dark, which is perfect for these spooky tales. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about Lynn. Lynn is an Appalachian storyteller, and she has been called one of the top 20 ghost storytellers in the country. About Lynn's work at her website, and Scotty is going to put that website in the Zoom chat. So if you want to find out more about Lynn and her storytelling, you can go to that after the session. But let's jump into the questions. Welcome, Lynn. We're so glad to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Renee.
Well, before we jump into storytelling and our exploration and some of the stories you're going to tell us, can you explain to everyone what the meaning of Appalachian is? Because some people might not be familiar with that term.
Sure. Appalachian is a person of African American Appalachian heritage or Black Appalachian heritage. More than 20 years ago, to remind folks that the hills are a place of diversity, that there are many cultures there. Group of poets connected to the Appalachian region.
You know, Black and Appalachia website if you want to learn more about Black communities in Appalachia. But now for the part that everyone is here for, the story.
It as a career move. I'm the fourth generation storyteller that we know of in the family. I'm just the first one to get paid for was Edward McLean or Macklin, depending on which part of the family was saying it, Cooper. He was a member of the last graduating classes of the 477th Bombardment Group of the Tuskegee Airmen, but he didn't tell much about that story. He would tell scary stories as bedtime stories to me, and I loved him. My sister was terrified of him, and my brother, sometimes he was okay with it and sometimes he wasn't. My second favorite storyteller was my grandfather, or Pops, Bayard Wilmer Arkwood, my mother's father. And he was a tall tale teller, but Grandma Jo said he was just a liar. He would try to tell stories to get himself out of trouble with her at times, and he could make up something on the spot. And I learned from him some things that maybe I shouldn't have learned, because she would ask him if he had done something. And I can remember one time he broke her punch bowl, but instead of saying yes or no, he would always say, it's a possibility. So I would try that too, Renee, and didn't work for me when I was 4 or 5 years old. And my great-grandparents were also some of my favorite storytellers. Grandpa Jerome, my great-grandfather, or Great Pops as I called him, that's my dad. His nickname was Jake. And he told all kinds of stories, sometimes making them up in the car, but he told a lot of animal folk tales too. The kind that some folks call Brer Rabbit, but we just called him Rabbit in our family because there were a lot of different rabbits. There was Brer, there was Bro, there was Bruh, there was Ms. Rabbit, there was She Rabbit, there was Ms. Molly. They were all rabbits. You heard rabbit tales. Scotty, can we get to the next one? A picture of that's Pops with the dark hair. And that's his father, Jerome Bonaparte Arkwood, beside him. I got contacted by a woman who said, your family is part of the Bonapartes, the heritage of art family in the United States. You know, their slaves were also named Bonaparte. And I'd like to do some research on your family. And and then the next picture, if you can get to it, Scott, that's my mother who read to us every night. And her family was the kind of family that would sit around the table and you'd hear all the family stories. And thanks to my mother reading to us, I could read by the time I was 3 years old. I'd figured that those marks on the page had meaning. And I was already telling stories, but my mother said they were called lies. So I was born into it, Renee.
Well, and you've used the lies, and I think something that I found really interesting is that a lot of storytelling competitions are called liars competitions.
Yes, yeah.
And it's so interesting because for some people, lies and lying seems like a negative connotation, but it's also used in such a different way when you're talking about storytelling.
Absolutely. Thanks, Scotty. You can take that down now. There is a difference between telling a lie, which you don't want to get caught in, and telling a story. But in the larger general realm of storytelling, all fiction is made up. Therefore, you could call them lies. But a liar's contest is a tall tale contest. And the one who can tell the biggest tale wins. I actually won a liar's contest for the National Association of Black Storytellers. And I got a huge trophy made out of gold plastic. I thought that was very appropriate. And when I was talking about some things with some students, I didn't want to tell them I got an award for lying, because that you don't want them to think, oh, that's what I'm going to do.
Yes. Well, and I think a lot of it comes to, like you said, the tall tales, but also being the one who's best able to convince the audience that it's not a tall tale, that it's actually the truth, is part of that sort of liars competition. And I love that concept.
Oh, yes.
I have a few good storytellers stroke liars in my family too.
Yeah. And sometimes the story is such a whopper that people don't invest in it as the reality, but they invest in how well you've told the story. So that's
Definitely.
important too. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I read a lot. I love stories. If there was a way for me to spend my entire life reading, I would be very happy to do that. And when I'm reading, I mean, I often feel that places are often almost their own character in a book. Especially with some authors, they do such a good job of making the place as tangible as the people that they're talking about. So within the stories that you tell, how important is Appalachia? I mean, its setting, its history, the culture, the traditions there. How important is that to the stories that you tell?
Extremely important. But there's also that connection for me to the woods. Mm-hmm. Walking in the woods, or the little house that's in the woods in some spooky stories, you can't get around that for atmospheres. So I may not say a lot about it, but in my mind, I'm seeing that place, or I'm remembering a place that fits into the story. I spent a lot of time in East Liverpool, Ohio. That's Appalachian, Ohio, of course. And there was a house that was kind of, to me, a shack behind my great-grandparents' home there. And a couple moved in and were going to fix it up. And I can remember the young woman running to my great-grandma, Essie, and telling her that she thought the place was haunted. And that sparked a story when I became a professional storyteller. I'd already told the story before that, but that sparked a story about the ghost that might be in that house. But I could see the house as I was telling it. And there's no other place that would have fit except that part of Ohio, and that particular house. So setting is extreme. Well, I can't say that for everybody's stories, but for me, and I'm sure for many others of Appalachian heritage, setting is very important.
Yeah. And like you said, the atmosphere that it creates is so important to those stories. And I think you're right, especially with spooky stories. I mean, so much. I mean, all you need to do is hear those creaks in an old house, or the wind in the trees, and it does give you all those feelings.
Oh, yeah. And the difference between a leafy tree and one is, bushes rustling and the branches scratching against the side of the house or a window. All of that has an impact in your story sharing.
Definitely. And so that leads us to the spooky stories. And that's our focus tonight. We're talking about spookers and haints, and story, or having one told to us, those stories that are meant to raise goosebumps and get all the hairs on the back of your neck sticking up.
storyteller or story writer. So there's that feeling of relief. There's that feeling of being cautious, but coming out of the other side, usually safe. You can't say that about scary movies. Sometimes the ends leave you startled and kind of uncomfortable, but usually a spoken word story brings you through those woods and safely out the other side. And for children, facing the dragon and knowing that not only can you survive, but you can defeat the dragon, it's very, very important for their well-being. And if you want to start some if-then processing, scary stories are a place where you start. I don't tell horribly scary stories to little children. If they say they want a scary story, they're going to get a silly story. but they will have faced something and feel good about coming out of the other end of that story. And they've thought about, well, if this happened, then that had to happen. And if this happened, then that had to happen. Those are problem-solving skills, not just for logic in math, but for logic in life. And we need to do more of that, not necessarily spooky stories. If you're a parent who doesn't like those, please don't try to tell them to your children, because they'll know that you're not investing in it. But if you enjoy the stories, find a safe and gentle way to share something like that with the kids.
It's interesting what you said about the contrast between watching a scary movie and hearing a scary story. Like, I cannot cope with really scary movies. I get creeped out so easily, and then it sticks with me forever. And it's really lots of sleepless nights. But I do love to hear scary stories and ghost stories and to tell them too. So I hadn't really thought about what the difference between those two things were until you were talking about it. But the emotional release of it is also something I hadn't thought about how important it is to sort of have that emotional release at the end of the story and feel safe again at the end.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. There's an escapism, of course, in that. When you're bombarded with somebody else's vision of how it should be, there's no escaping that in a movie. And it's probably not necessarily the way you would tell the story, even if you loved it. But when you can create the stories in your head, create those scenes, the setting, perhaps the dialogue that the storyteller never shared, but you're feeling it, you feel safer. And I feel like it's a healthier way to walk into the darkness and to meet the monsters and come out of the other side.
Yeah. Yeah. So where do you get your spooky stories from? What are some of their origins? And do you also make up your own stories?
A lot of my material started with my dad telling stories, but I was the child who would ask for those spooky stories. And I really wasn't afraid of them. I was curious about them. My great-grandmother had said, as far as ghosts and spooky things, dead folks don't bother you much. It's the living folks you need to worry about. And I was I was a teenager before I realized what that really meant. But I think it started with me being a story listener and then pursuing such stories in printed format in the third grade. In those days, the child was never supposed to be in the adult section of the library. And I had read everything I wanted to read in the children's section. So I would get down on my belly and I would crawl across the floor, thinking I was sneaking in front of the librarian over to the adult section. And I would sit on the floor. For some reason, I was afraid to stand, and I'd reach up to whatever my arm could reach. But I was reading Poe and Ray Bradbury and Saki and other stories in the third grade. And sometimes I'd get so scared, I'd sneak the book back over to the children's section. And then, afraid to try to take it back, I would stick it into some books. And I know now that the librarian probably knew exactly what I was doing, But I started looking at the literary formats. And by the time I was in 5th grade, I could tell spooky stories to scare my cousins, compete with my dad, him telling one portion of the story and me telling another portion of the story. I loved doing that. So there was a lot of familial influence on my spooky story sharing.
And do you also take like well-known spooky stories and make them your own? Because I mean, there's some that people sort of have a version of, that everyone's heard a version of certain spooky stories. Do you ever take some of those and make them your own?
I think because the ones in my family weren't quite the same as what others might have heard. Yes, I was already doing that, but it was because I'd absorbed it. Mm-hmm. But I'll twist a fairy tale in a minute. One of my versions of Sleeping Beauty turns her into a vampire.
I would like that one.
And Red Riding Hood, it comes from a family of werewolves, but you don't change until you reach the age of 13. Says a lot for puberty. Yeah. And I have a version of the Three Billy Goats Gruff that's actually not a troll under a bridge, but a serial killer. So yeah, I'll twist any story that I can, but not somebody's copyrighted material. It has to come, originally from my brain and my mentality on the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, this was a point where you were going to tell us one of your stories, Lynn. So I'm going to hand it over to you to give us a little bit of a spook.
Let's see. What will I tell? This might be the place where this isn't the place where we were going to try to show the video. This is actually something that is in rough draft format. I've only told it a couple times, but within it, you're going to hear a bit of family folklore, and you may be able to relate to that. There was also my research on it. There is a smidgen of truth, the reality in it, but I think there's truth in every story, even if it's not real. And the story is called Mirror. And if you see me looking down, as I said, this is very new. So I have my notes. Yes, storytellers have notes too. The ritual was old, perhaps older than that one about Bloody Mary, but I can't be sure. A young woman would walk backwards up the stairs in the dark, holding a candle in her right hand and a mirror in her left hand. Or she would hold that candle in her right hand, and when she got to the top of the stairs in the dark, there would be a mirror waiting there for her. When she reached the top of the stairs and looked into the mirror, she might see her future husband's face beside hers in the mirror. But if she made the mistake of holding the candle in her left hand, she would see death's shadow or the ghost of some dead girl behind her, and she would be drawn into the mirror or shoved down the stairs. Now, if she was drawn into the mirror, the dead girl's ghost would take her place and become her changeling, live among the living again. And if the girl survived the shove, well, she'd die in 7 years, or she would never marry. I guess in those days, never marrying was considered by some to be a fate worse than death for a young woman. This was an old ritual, or a variation on one. When my cousins and their friends told me this, I thought it was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. Walking up the dark stairs backwards was bad enough. But then there was the possibility of breaking the mirror and falling on glass, or setting yourself on fire with the candle. Looking for and finding a boyfriend in the mirror, to me, that was the worst possible outcome. But you have to understand, I was 6 years old, and these were teenage girls. Now, someone had modified the ritual by our times. All one had to do was stand before a mirror in a darkened room and stare at the mirror without blinking. Press your hands, the fingers of your right hand, against the glass and say your own name 3 times, preceded by I am. And then you would add to that, let me see who loves me. For example, I am Lynn. I am Lynn. I am Lynn. Let me see who loves me. Then you would see someone in the mirror. Now, we were at my grandma's house, and those older teenagers were supposed to be babysitting all the little cousins who were supposed to be asleep while all the grown-ups went to a late New Year's Eve church service called Watch Night. I stayed awake with the so-called babysitters. Even though I was 6 years old, I figured I was too mature to have to go to bed. Now, the perfect mirror for the ritual was in our grandparents' bedroom on the inside of the closet door. With the bedroom lights out and the door closed, one's eyes had to adjust to that pitch black space. A girl was supposed to stay in there until something happened, and something usually did. The girl was supposed to stay in there and say those words and wait for that something to happen. And what happened? Screams, lots of screams and giggles, growls and snarls, rattling of the doorknob and banging on the door by the others in the bedroom. And I didn't know if anyone really saw anything, but they came out laughing or crying or fussing. And they got to choose the next one to go into the closet. Thinking about that now, I wonder, why was I with these people? Now, one girl didn't want to play. Her name was Pat, and she was kind of new to the neighborhood. And she was refusing to take her turn, even though she'd been picked several times. I said, I'll play. I want to see the dark. And the cousins said things like, you can't see the dark, idiot. And you don't care about boyfriends, so why should you play? Or they'd just say, shut up. Now, Pat was still refusing, and her voice quivered as she pulled on her long, dark braid. She said, when we played this before, I touched the mirror with the fingers on my right hand, and I felt like something was trying to pull me through. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. I'm not playing. Now, teenagers can tease and beg and torment like no one else can. I kept volunteering, but nobody paid any attention to me. And finally, Pat gave in. She slowly walked toward the closet, slowly opened the door. Slowly walked inside and closed that door. We could hear her say her name, begin to say the words. I am Pat. I am Pat. I am Pat. Let me see. But she didn't finish. She didn't finish that rhyme. And we waited for something to happen. No one approached the door. Everyone was listening for her to finish saying those words. And she wasn't saying anything. There was no giggling. There was no laughing. Everyone sat quietly in the darkness, waiting for Pat to finish that rhyme. Finally, I got tired of waiting. I walked over to the door and I knocked on it. I called, Pat, Pat. I called her name a few times, and then that door slowly opened. The doorknob turned. The door moved. And Pat stepped out. She didn't say anything. It was difficult to see her face in the darkness, but she was pulling on that long braid that was now over the other shoulder. And her eyes seemed dull, seemed strange. If I'd been old enough to know the word, I would have said lifeless. Then in almost a whisper, Pat said, "There was someone in the mirror." She walked away from us out of the room. We heard the front door open. We heard the front door close. Pat had left. And so my cousins decided that the game was over. The older girls told me I had to go to bed. I had to go into a room with little cousins tucked into the twin beds. Some at the top of the bed, some at the bottom of the bed, their feet in the middle, tickling at one another, but they were snoring. Older cousins and their friends were asleep on the floor in bedrolls or sleeping bags. Now, I had brought my sleeping bag because I was not sleeping with all those little cousins. And I slid into it, and I felt comforted by all the snoring I could hear around me. I couldn't sleep. I could hear the teenagers talking in the living room downstairs. They couldn't seem to sleep either. After midnight, parents started showing up. They started gathering up sleeping and drowsy little bodies, carefully carrying them to the cars, sliding them gently into the seats, quietly closing the car doors, and everyone going home. But that wasn't my plan, you see. We lived just up the hill, and I'd already offered to help my grandparents with the New Year's Day cooking and baking. 6 years old, I couldn't do much, but I knew I was a favorite, and I knew I could spend the night. So I got to stay with Grandpa and Grandma. Early in the morning, Grandma gave me a chore. "I don't know what you all were doing," she said, "and I don't want to know. But there's fingerprints all over my mirror. Go clean it off for me." I said, "Yes, ma'am." I was good at cleaning mirrors. Grandma handed me a dampened cloth and a jar in which she had put cold water and white vinegar. I went up the stairs and realized which mirror I was supposed to clean, and I kind of slowed down. And when I got to the bedroom, I kind of stood at the closed door for a while. And then I opened it as slowly as Pat had the night before. And I wasn't sure what I'd find inside there. I wasn't sure what I might see. Clothes. Just clothes. Grandma's clothes and shoes. And the mirror on the inside of the door. I kept the door open as I tried to wipe away the fingerprints. I made sure it was open wide. I tried and tried to scrub away those fingerprints, but they seemed to stay. I kept on trying. It took me about 4 tries to realize that the fingerprints were on the inside of the glass. Well, I didn't stand there and say my name, and I didn't ask to see anyone, but I found myself reaching out, the fingers of my right hand, reaching toward the mirror. And then I stopped myself, and I backed away from the mirror, and I left the closet door open as I ran for the stairs and down the stairs to my grandma. For I had seen someone in the mirror. That someone was crying, and she was pulling on her long braid, a braid that hung over her shoulder. Now, I didn't tell Grandma what I'd seen. I just told her that I couldn't get the fingerprints off the glass. And she said she'd look at it later and gave me some other chore to do. And I still don't know if she saw what I had seen. I was sent home to put on some fresh clothes. And as I walked up the hill, I saw Pat sitting on the glider on her front porch. Even though it was cold outside, she was pulling on that braid. And I didn't look directly at her, but I was trying to figure out which side was the braid on before she went into the closet. I couldn't remember. And I wouldn't look at her. And I didn't say anything to her, and she didn't say anything to me. Not that moment or any moment after that. A couple days later, I caught Grandma burying something in the flower bed behind her house. It was a big cloth bag, and she was digging deep to bury it. And when I asked her what it was, she said it was broken glass. I said, "Ooh, Grandma, you broke glass? That's 7 years bad luck." And my grandma said, "There's no bad luck in it if you break the glass on purpose." Next day, my grandfather came home with a brand new mirror, but they hung it on the outside of the closet door, and nobody ever explained why. I grew up and I still wondered whatever happened to Pat. She didn't go to school with my cousins. She ended up at a private school, and she married young, and she moved away from the hills. From what I was told, she moved far, far away. And I wonder if she, whoever or whatever she is still alive. I wonder if she lives in a house that has any mirrors. And I wonder if she looks into the mirror, who does she see?
That was good.
Thank you.
I got very creeped out during that.
Well, there's some, as I said, there's a touch of reality in it. The older cousins playing games like that. Mm. They'd also call boys when they weren't supposed to be on the phone, and they would make prank calls and things like that, or crank calls. But they would play games like that. And
I remember doing the Bloody Mary game and being scared out of my wits.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Well, and I have 3 cousin Pats. None of them just disappeared. I put the name Pat in there because I thought of my cousins and the Pats were all older than I was. My grandma, she did break a mirror. And she did say that there was no bad luck if you broke it on purpose. And the mirror in her closet was chipped, and she always wanted to replace it. So I get the feeling that she broke it on purpose so that Pop-Pops would buy her another mirror. But she didn't just throw the pieces away. She buried it in the flower bed, never explained why. Mm-hmm. And all of that became the story that you heard.
Well, I mean, I feel very privileged that you were trying it out in some of its first outings with us. So thank you for that, Lynn.
Oh, thank you for listening to it. Yeah, I consider it still rough draft just because thanks to the pandemic, I haven't been on a lot of stages where I might go ahead and hone the story by telling it.
Yeah. Well, and some of what happened in that story sort of leads into my next question, which is about storytelling methods, how you build up expectations or tension, sound effects, different voices, body language, how all of that might play into the success of a story. And obviously there were elements of that in that story, but tell us a little bit about that.
The facial expressions I just inherited those. They used to say that Pop-Pops had a rubber face, and I think I got stuck with it too. Not necessarily thrilled about that. When I was a teenager, I would try to sit very prim and properly and just, not laugh loud. Now it's a good tool for what I do. The eyes opening wide, and sometimes the facial expressions, the body language. Of course, we're sitting in the Zoomiverse and we're all in our little boxes. So it's not exactly what I would do on stage, but the body language comes from what's happening in the story. Each gesture should have some meaning and help people to follow the path of the story. So I do try to keep that in mind. And I am a stutterer. So when I was little, there would be times when the little fist would ball up as I tried to get words out. And great grandma said, just breathe, honey. And she didn't know anything about meditation or anything like that, breathing exercises or anything. She just helped me relax. And I found that when I told stories, I didn't seem to stutter. Mm. When I sang in the church choir, I didn't seem to stutter. When I recited poetry, I didn't seem to stutter. So storytelling actually helped me to overcome a great deal of that. And now I don't want the fist balled up unless that's what the character is doing, right? So, yeah, I thought this might be a good example of that, the story that I just shared. But there's also another one, if Scott can bring up the video. That's kind of atmospheric. So I hope that gives an example too.
Yeah, he'll bring it up in just a second and we'll get a chance to watch that.
I want to tell you a little story about my grandfather. When he was a young man, he was, shall we say, no better than he should be. And he was still living with his mother and his father, working. But after work on Friday evening, instead of going home, he would walk down to the bar with some of his friends. And he'd sit down and he'd laugh with his friends, and he'd drink with his friends, and he'd laugh with his friends, and he'd drink with his friends, and he'd drink with his friends, drink until he was what some folks call 3 sheets in the wind. He would drink until everything seemed funny and a bit fuzzy. And then he'd walk out of the bar and prepare to go home. Didn't have a car, thank goodness. He had to walk. And he knew that if he just followed the tracks that passed the bar, just stayed on those tracks, eventually he would find home. Tracks went past their house. And so he stepped onto the tracks and he was walking along, rocking and reeling and wavering and stumbling. And he said he saw someone on the tracks. And he got a little closer because he was worried. You see, he could hear a woman crying, and even though he wasn't sober, the sound of a crying woman touched his heart. So he kept on stepping forward, and there she was, sure enough, but she was crouched down as if she was looking for something, and she was wailing and weeping and moaning, oh, I have to find it, or he'll know no peace. My grandfather realized it was Miss Smith, the neighbor. Well, he walked toward her as quickly as he could, and he said, Miss Smith, did you lose something? Oh, she said, I have to find it. Miss Smith, don't worry. I'll help you look for it, he said, and he started looking, and then he said he realized he didn't know what he was looking for. Miss Smith, can you tell me, what is it? And she didn't say. She just kept moaning and crying. I have to find it, or he'll know no peace. Miss Smith, he said, well, can you tell me what it looks like? How big is it? And she held out her hands as if she was cradling a baby. But Miss Smith was too old for babies. Miss Smith, well, can you tell me what color it is? And she said, well, is brown. At least it was. And he thought, did she lose a dog or a cat? And he didn't know Miss Smith had any pets, but he kept on looking, trying to figure out what he was supposed to find. And then Miss Smith squealed like a little girl. Oh, there it is. And she trotted forward and she reached down and she picked something up and she held it close to her heart. And as she held it and petted it, that thing in her arms turned and it looked up at her and it smiled and it said, "Hello, Mama." And then it turned so that the eyes looked at my grandfather and it said, "Hello, Bayard." And my grandfather said he realized what Miss Smith had been looking for, and he started running. A few years back, Miss Smith's son, drunk, 3 sheets in the wind, had walked down those same railroad tracks trying to find his way home. And a train had come along, and he wasn't sober enough to get off the tracks. And that train tore his head from his body. They'd found the body, but they never found the head. And Miss Smith had always said he would know no peace. And then my grandfather realized something else. Just the year before, Miss Smith had died too. Well, my grandfather said he started running down those tracks, and by the time he got to his house, he was sober. And he said that he didn't go to the bar, didn't drink for a long, long time. Now, I was a little girl when my pop-pops told me that. Smart enough to think about what he said. Not wise enough to know. And so I asked him, "Pop-Pops, is that story true?" And my grandfather said, "Well, if it ain't, it should be."
That was another good one.
Thank you.
It didn't even occur to me that that's what she was holding in her arms.
Well,
I knew it was going to be something scary, but it didn't occur to me that that's what it would be.
well, Pop-Pops, I think he would tell cautionary tales, but they would be disguised in this way. And as I said, he was no better than he should have been. He actually he had a couple stills. And
as Appalachian people do.
Yes, and I don't like the stereotype that people give to that, but yeah, Pop-Pops had at least 2, and he would say he was going fishing, and he was actually checking the stills that he had with some friends, and then he would bring back no fish, but he'd have these jars that he would call his special water, you understand? But he didn't want his grandchildren to follow in his footsteps. And he went to church every Sunday. He was very, very active in the church. He was one of the leaders of the church, but still he'd had that youth. And so I think he told stories like this to try to tone us down and, kind of keep us away from the patterns that he'd had when he was a young man. When he first told me, that folks would start young. And as I have discovered, I've been in Ireland a couple of times to tell stories. When there's a storytelling gathering, Kaylee, the adults have the children at their feet, at least where I was, Cape Clear Island, which has an international storytelling festival. There would be generations there, and no story was off limits. The children would sit at the feet of their parents or their elders. And if they had a question, they just, look up behind them and they'd whisper their question and somebody'd give an answer. And I could tell that they would go home and talk about the stories, a little different than the way things are here, where you have children's stories and adult stories. And so I don't know why, but I have found I can't give an explanation other than traditions. In many gatherings of Appalachian or Afro-Latin families, you don't send the kids out of the room for the story. As I was coming up, we ended up with front porch stories, which was the women sitting on the front porch and telling, and the kids were okay to be around that. And you'd have the around the table stories, which were family stories. And then you had the back porch stories. And that was my pop-ups and his cronies with the special water back there sometimes. So, yeah. There was a moral to this, but when I was little, that one did scare me.
Yeah.
Because there were railroad tracks across the road from my great-grandparents' home. And I would always think, if I managed to sneak across the tracks, which I wasn't supposed to do, and get into the woods, I had to start coming home before it got dark, because there might be something on the tracks.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think rail tracks, train tracks have their own character too. They're often something that can be made very, very spooky in movies and in stories. And my house is right beside some train tracks, and I remember as a kid having sort of the same feeling. So I understand.
Yes.
Well, in your experience as a storyteller, do you find that there's similar spooky stories or monsters, or ones that at least seem to have had some sort of origin that was similar, but have evolved differently across the United States and even internationally? You were just talking about being in Ireland. Do you sometimes see some convergence of these stories from different cultures and from different places?
Oh, yes. Of course, there are the stories of little people around the world, not necessarily fairies, not necessarily leprechauns, but and in Africa, on the continent of Africa, there are different names for the different types of little people. The one I can think of is the Moatia, and that's from the Ashanti people in the Akan language. And they are little people who became, in the Caribbean area, the little people who walk on backwards feet. The Jumbies, some of the Jumbies are little people who walk on backwards feet. And they're not necessarily somebody that you want to meet. They're not somebody you're going to catch to try and get a pot of gold. You want to avoid them completely. But those concepts blend into some of the stories in the Appalachian region. The little people, certain little people might take your child and leave a changeling in its place. And that's something that comes not just from the British Isles, but from stories along the west coast of Africa and other places on the continent. Among the indigenous people of the Appalachian region, there are little people, they're kinder than some of them. But yeah, culturally, things may change according to what fits the concepts of a culture. But a good story travels, and it's used in whatever way fits the storytelling traditions. When you hear of witches and boo hags, some of the tales of what are called witches on the continent of Africa are actually what we might call vampires. They're bloodsuckers or energy drainers. And I don't remember any vampires in Appalachian or Afro-Latin stories, but there are the boo hags who will peel their skin at night and go out and do horrible things. The cows won't give milk, the hens won't lay eggs, somebody might die, but they can also drain the energy out of a person. There's that term called riding the hag, when you'd wake up in the middle of the night and you're stiff, and supposedly the boo hag was riding you all night long. So yeah, those stories, they change with the people. One of my favorites, though, he's called the Green Man in Ohio. He's called Bigfoot in some other places, the Sasquatch or Sasquatch. When you get to the Pacific coast up into Alaska, he is defeated by an old man and he's thrown into a fire and burnt into ashes. And each one of the ashes or embers turns into the little vampire that we call the mosquito. And so the story explains how the mosquitoes came to be. You don't hear that on the eastern coast of the United States, but you hear about Bigfoot-like creatures across the country and in other countries too.
Yeah, I've never heard that origin for the mosquito, but I like that. But I know that a lot of people in this area call the Bigfoot a wood booger. So that's what we call him down in this part of Appalachia, is wood boogers.
A wood booger?
Yeah, and there's a wood booger festival. I think it's up near Norton, Virginia. So just a bit further down to the point of Virginia in Southwest Virginia, they have a wood booger festival. So,
oh, nice. And we have the Green Man. He's supposed to be green like grass, but he's the same big monstrous creature. And I will never forget. I was watching something on TV about the cryptids. I like looking at those stories. And there were two men who went into a field someplace near Akron, Ohio, and they were talking about, this is the nest of a Bigfoot. You see this pile. This is the nest of a Bigfoot, because nobody else would put these branches together in that way. Well, my husband has kin in Akron. And so we were up there visiting, and this farmer was, he was saying, yeah, I couldn't understand it. These men come along. My son and I had just finished cutting away the growth and throwing it in a pile. They started talking about Bigfoot. So that kind of blew that whole show for me. But yeah, it became a whole different story.
Yes, I think probably that might be the explanation sometimes, but I hold on to hope that there's a few real cryptids out there. So.
I wouldn't doubt that there are a lot of things that we just don't understand. You know, I'm open to the possibilities. I'm not going to say I believe all the hooting and hollering about stuff that goes along with them, but I'm absolutely certain that there's a lot that we don't know.
Definitely. And so that leads us to our last question. I think you were also going to share one last story with us, which is, what is your favorite spooker or haint?
Oh, that's something that my father told me. And he told it as a bedtime story with my sister, my brother, and me tucked into my mom and daddy's bed. And I can remember him sitting on the side of the bed telling the story. And then we were supposed to go to bed and go to sleep. It's a story called Sifting Sand. A farmer had a field that he wanted to plant with taters so he could make a little more money. But the field had lain fallow for a long, long time. It was covered with rocks and overgrown with weeds, and the soil needed to be turned, fertilized, aerated, what some folks call sifted. The farmer had one young son, nobody else to help him with the work, so he figured he'd hire somebody to get that field ready and help with the planting before the season was over. And he sent word into town that whoever would come and help with that field would have plenty to eat and a place to sleep in the little cabin that sat at the very middle of that field. But if somebody came to help with that work in the daytime, they were gone when the sun went down. And if they came in the evening, they never stayed till midnight, because that cabin and the whole field around it were haunted. If just the hint of the shadow of a cloud fell on that field, something would rise in that shadow and walk across that field and right through the gate to the fence around that cabin and right into the cabin. So nobody stayed. And after a while, Nobody came looking for work there either. The farmer figured he'd just have to do with the harvest that he'd already gathered from other fields, because he wasn't going to be able to get the work done in time to do any more planting. Then early one evening, a young man came to the back door of the farmhouse. And when the farmer opened it, there stood what you call a tall drink of water. A young man, tall and thin, dressed in a brand new pair of jeans and a pair of brand new work boots with nice thick soles and brand new laces. Farmer opened the screen door for him and he looked him up and down, and the man grinned at him. Young man said, "Hi, my name is Jack Spratt." "Well, that's what folks call me because I'm so skinny. That's not really my name. You could call me Jack. I come to see if you got some work for me to do." And the farmer said, well, yes, there's work that needs to be done. There's this field that has been fallow for so long, and I want to turn it to sift it and to plant it with taters. But, well, there's this predicament, you see. There's this ghost. "Oh, say no more about that," said Jack Spratt. "I heard about that in town. I'm not afraid of things like that. I'm not afraid of much of anything. So if you give me a bite to eat and a place to spend the night, I will be ready to work for you come morning." Well, the farmer and his young son took Jack down to that cabin. They walked him through the back gate and through the kitchen and through the front room and right out to the front porch. They settled him in the old rocket chair there, and they brought him an oil lamp to light the front room, and they lit the cook stove to make sure it would be nice and warm in there, and they brought him a piece of fat back to grease a big old skillet and a sack of taters from the harvest on another field, so that he'd have something to eat that night. And the farmer, well, he sharpened Jack's little knife that Jack unfolded from his pocket, and he gave Jack some tobacco when he saw that Jack carried a pipe. And then he and his son left Jack sitting on the front porch, rocking in the rocking chair, peeling and slicing taters and dropping those slices into his hat, puffing on his pipe as he rocked back and forth. The lamp was lit in the front room. The cook stove was getting nice and warm. The farmer and his son went back on up to the farmhouse, get a good night's sleep. And Jack sat there rocking back and forth, peeling and slicing taters, puffing on that pipe. And then the sun went down. From the far corner of the field, Jack thought he heard something. Sounded like somebody singing. "I'm coming across the field, sifting sand, cooey coo. It's just the wind," Jack said to himself. "That's just the wind." And he kept on rocking and puffing on his pipe and peeling and slicing those taters when he heard something come from about midway from the edge of the field and that front gate. "I'm coming across the field, sifting sand, cooey coo." "That's that farmer's son trying to play tricks on me," said Jack. "But I ain't afraid of that. I ain't afraid of anything." And he just kept on peeling and slicing taters, rocking in that rocking chair, puffing on his pipe. Then he heard, "I'm standing at the front gate, sifting sand, cooey coo." Jack stopped rocking and he dropped his pipe. He took a deep breath and he said, You know, it's getting kind of cold out here. I think I'll go inside. And Jack gathered up everything that he had and headed for the front door of that little cabin. But just in case it was the farmer's son playing tricks on him, Jack sang back, well, I'm heading for the front door, toting the taters, cooey coo. He went on in that house. Now, by that time, the cast iron skillet was nice and hot on that cook stove. And Jack took that piece of fat back and dropped it in there. It started sizzling and popping, made the whole place smell like bacon. And Jack heard, I'm heading up the front steps, smelling the fat back, cooey coo. And thinking it was the farmer's son, Jack said, well, I'm standing in the kitchen, greasing the skillet, cooey coo. And he dropped all those taters into that skillet. Oh, it started smelling so good. He shook that skillet. He heard, I'm coming through the front door, smelling the taters, cooey coo. And right then, that lamp in the front room went out. Well, Jack turned himself and said, I'm heading for the back door, quick as I can, cooey coo. And he started running out the back door. He heard something saying, I'm coming in the kitchen, smelling the taters, cooey coo. Jack said, well, I'm running for the back steps, quick as I can, cooey coo. Voice said, I'm coming through the back door, quick as I can, cooey coo. Jack sang, I'm running for the back gate, quick as I can, cooey coo. And then he felt something warm at the back of his neck, and the voice sang, I'm right behind you, about to get you, sifting sand, cooey coo. Gotcha. Well, early the next morning, the farmer woke up and he smelled taters and fatback. And when he looked out the window, he saw smoke rising from the chimney hole of that cook stove. So he thought Jack had done all right for himself. Farmer went and got his young son, and they headed down to get Jack to do some work in that field. But when they got to the back gate, there, just inside the gate, lying on the ground, was a pair of brand new blue jeans and a pair of brand new work boots with nice thick soles and brand new laces and nobody in them. Farmer said, I wonder what happened to Jack Spratt. His son said, Daddy, I don't care what happened to Jack Spratt. Sun ain't up all the way yet, and there's shadows on this here field, and I'm wondering where that ghost is. And a voice came from the kitchen. I'm standing in the kitchen, eating the taters, sprinkled with Jack Spratt. Sure tastes good. Then my father would tuck us in, kiss us goodnight, and expect us to go to sleep. But that's one of my favorite stories from my daddy.
That was a good one.
Thank you.
I can't imagine having that right before bed, though.
Oh, I loved it. In fact, I'd ask for it, and my sister would scream, no! And my brother would cover his ears. And sometimes when my dad would start telling him if he tucked us into their big bed, because he and mom weren't going to sleep yet, they'd run. My sister and brother would run. And then I'd have my daddy all to myself to tell me stories, which I loved.
Well, Lynn, this has been wonderful. And I know I've seen some questions come up in the chat. So I will turn this over to Scotty now so he can be sure that we get all the questions from the audience to you. But we've had a few people I've seen like doing hand claps and applause. So people are enjoying it. But
good.
Scotty, what kind of questions do we have from our audience? Oh, you're muted.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you now.
Sorry. So, Lynn, first, I just want to say it's always great talking to you, but those 3 stories were all awesome.
Thank you. Thank you, Scotty.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Our first question is from our colleague, Marissa. I think she actually asked this question before you even started. So. She says, "Hi, Lynn. My question for you is, what would you say as an Appalachian storyteller, what makes this an important part of Appalachian history?"
I think the Appalachian history is still being discovered. Appalachian heritage in all its cultural diversity deserves respect, not the stereotypes, not the single story. And so I think it's important to be inclusive and to share from the Black Appalachian or Afro-Appalachian heritage. Its folk tales overlap, folk tales in the hills. The exchange of instruments is known, such as the banjo, which began in African musical instrument heritage, but the stories aren't necessarily known, or you'll hear somebody say, well, we don't have stories like that. I think it's important to include everyone's stories and to respect and honor them.
Awesome. Okay, so next we've got one from Karen Martin, and she says, "How do you gauge the receptiveness of a story with a live audience? If you sense a story isn't received as anticipated, what adjustments, if any, do you make?"
So, Scotty, you went out a couple of times during that, so I'm going to repeat that question in case
I can get it. I thought my internet's kind of wonky, so I saw that it was going live.
Yeah. So the question from Karen Martin was, how do you gauge the receptiveness of a story with a live audience? If you sense a story isn't received as anticipated, what adjustments, if any, do you make?
I don't tell spooky horror stories to children. I don't think I tell horror stories at all. There's not really blood, guts, and gore in the story. So that makes them something that most audiences that come to spooky or spookers and haints types of programs, that makes them willing to listen and to invest in the universe of that story. But I watch in live performance, I watch people's faces, their body language, whether or not they're making eye contact with me. And that lets me know if they're on the same path. For children, it's silly stories, and they're all interactive. So the children become involved. They become a part of the story. They're also the story sharers. And so that they become very receptive to that. If it looks like a story isn't going over well, I kind of step back into my editorial mode, and I try to gauge what is appropriate for that moment. And I don't generally have a problem like that. People seem to be receptive. If it's not going over well, it could very well be that it's too late in the evening, that people are ready to go home. Sometimes it's the story before mine that has thrown people off. So if the story before mine was really horrible, a horrible situation happened, I'll tell something that's kind of funny and pull them in with that. If the one before mine was a little muted, shall we say, and kind of dull, I'll tell something that has more excitement to it and get even adults involved in the story. There'll be something that they have to do, make a sound, say woo or something. So yeah, I try to be very attentive to the participants in the story. You can't be a storyteller without story listeners. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. And I was going to say, I know everybody has off nights, but I don't imagine you have a lot of crowds that aren't receptive. So.
Yeah, I'm fortunate. I'm blessed. I seem to be able to gauge before I start what might work. But I also talk to people in the audience. I don't just stay behind the curtain or anything. I go out and talk to people and I listen attentively. And that kind of lets me know where I'm going to start my program and what might work best.
Yeah. Okay, well, we have one more, and this one is from Andrew Hunt, and he says, as an actor, I'm curious, do you tell your stories as Lynn, or at times do you tell them in character?
I do tell in character. For example, the story of Red Riding Hood, it's called Red, and I am Grandma Hood, so to speak, telling the story of her own 13th birthday. And so I tell it in a soft grandmother-like voice while I'm rocking and telling Red the story. And then after she's talked about how her grandmother turned into a werewolf and she cut off her grandmother's hand thinking it was a wolf, and she found out her grandmother was a werewolf, she knew what her heritage would be. After we go through all of that, Red starts to feel the moonlight, and she says, that's my favorite story, Grandma. But tonight I feel so strange. So I kind of go from the grandmother character to Red rather than just being the narrator. And there are some other stories in which I do that. And there's one I tell about, it's actually something that happened, but I talk about my first funeral, having to go to the funeral because Mom was playing the piano and Dad and Grandpa were singing in the choir, and I'm sitting with my grandmother. But I tell it as a little girl with the voice of about 5 years old. And it's actually, my mother gets so embarrassed. She says, you shouldn't tell people that story. They'll think I was a bad mother. And I tell her, no, they'll think I was a bad kid. That's all.
Well, Lynn, Scotty, I didn't see any more questions, but I might have missed some. Did you see any more?
No, we don't have any more questions. I'm going to drop your website link into the chat one more time. So if anybody out there wants to visit Lynn's website and see any more content or hear any more content.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I will say, Lynn, is that there's not any more questions, but there are lots of very happy listeners. So you've gotten a lot of applause and thank yous and praise. And I will wholeheartedly back up what they are saying. We've had so much fun with you tonight.
Same here. I totally back that up as well. So.
Oh, and here's something exciting. Jenny Turman says, thank you so much for sharing your tradition. I am here with a class. Oops, it just scrolled up. Wait just a second. I'm here with a class of 24 students.
Wow.
At UVA-Wise, all in Intro to Appalachian Studies. So that's exciting that we've had a class with us.
Well,
I did not realize that. That makes it even better. Yeah.
Isn't that wonderful? Thank you all for being here. All the students and their instructors and everybody. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Yeah, and I will second that. We very much appreciate all of the listeners who have been with us tonight and who've spent a spooky evening with us. We've enjoyed getting spooky with you together, and we thank you so much for your support. I just want to tell you all a little bit. A few things that are coming up with the museum that you might be interested in. We have 2 more virtual speaker series this year. The next one is on Tuesday, November 9th. Usually we do our virtual speaker series on the first Tuesday of the month, but because that is election day and there is a big election in Virginia, we have moved it to the second Tuesday of the month, so November 9th. And we will have Jennifer Lico, a musician, with us, talking about the connections between Appalachia and Scottish folk songs. So that should be really interesting. And again, that's a free program. Then on Tuesday, December 7th, you will be here with us, Scotty and I, and our other curatorial colleague, Erica, talking about music and work. And that is to go along with our upcoming special exhibit, The Way We Worked, which is about the history of work. And there are a lot of music and songs that go along with the history of work. So we'll be talking about that. You can catch October's Farm and Funtime show on Tuesday, October 14th at 7 p.m. via Radio Bristol's Facebook Live or YouTube. This month it is featuring the Steel Wheels and Willie Carlisle, so we'd highly recommend that. Then on Thursday, October 28th at 12 noon, you can join us for a discussion in Radio Bristol Book Club about the Moon-Eyed People, folk tales from Welsh America, so continuing the storytelling tradition with our Radio Bristol Book Club pick. That is a book by Peter Stevenson, and I just started reading it tonight, and I told Lynn that he actually talks about her, so that's pretty exciting. And we will be also interviewing the author after that book discussion, and he will be coming to us all the way from Wales, so that's going to be very cool. And finally, please, if you have any questions or thoughts about Radio Bristol Book Club, I know that one of our regular virtual speaker series, Sheldon, has sent us a few of his thoughts on books. Or if you have any thoughts or questions that you would like to share with us about Museum Talk, our other radio show, which is on all the other Thursdays at 12 noon, please feel free to send them to us at museumtalk@birthplaceofcountrymusic.org, and we will be glad to include them on our Radio Bristol Book Club or on Museum Talk, depending on what it is about. But again, thank you, Lynn. This has been wonderful. Thank you to our audience. Please join us again in November, and we really appreciate you being here. And if you know of anyone who wanted to be here and who couldn't be, in about a week's time, it will go up on our website under Museum from Home, where you can see a recording of tonight's presentation. So thank you again. We were glad to be spooky with you.
Thank you all. Thank you for being with me. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Good night, everybody. Sleep well.
Yeah, I'm not sure we will, but yes.